Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, glad to be talking about the world of illustration, writing, picture books with author Katie Yamasaki. Katie, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
A pleasure, a pleasure. You've created numerous titles. I will mention a few: Shapes, Lines, and Light, When the Cousins Came, Mural Island, and I believe Happy Book Birthday today is Ripples, right? Ripples
That's
is out
right.
today.
Yes, thank you so
Nice.
much. Yeah.
Yeah, congratulations. Congratulations on that. How did you get into the world of authoring and illustrating?
When I was in college, I had kind of a late start into art. I wanted to be a social worker when I went to college, and I had never studied art formally. I was very crafty, but I had never learned how to draw. So my freshman year in college, I took my first drawing class and I was terrible. I was like, I would hang my drawings on the wall next to these very sophisticated students. And, it looked like, in hindsight, it looked like the work that now my, you know, students, when I was teaching, fourth graders, it would look like their work, but I loved it so much that it felt worth it. The embarrassment felt worth it because I loved the kind of way that drawing caused me to, look differently at the world and experience the world in a completely different way. And so it didn't feel like much of a sacrifice to kind of embarrass myself in a weekly critique. And then I kind of wondered, what would I do with the art because I wanted to do something useful. I wanted to feel like I was making a contribution in society. And in between my sophomore, I think it was my sophomore and junior years, my aunt's best friend, who she was a Tai Chi teacher, and this guy was a Tai Chi kind of master. They had been in Tai Chi school together in the 60s. His name was Ed Young. He is the author, or I mean, the illustrator of, over 80 or over 100 books for children. But at that time in the mid 90s, he had illustrated over 80 books and he needed somebody to come and live with his family, help take care of his daughter, and catalog his work that was being sent to the archives at University of Connecticut. So I had the opportunity to kind of go through his work from the very earliest sketches through finished art for those 80 books and kind of see this whole other world of art for children. And I hadn't experienced, art that featured, Asian protagonists or art that told these like cultural stories or these kind of folk tales. And it was such a miracle to see. And also the seeing his sketchbooks which were full of, like quote unquote kind of bad drawings, which was all I was making at that time. And so he was so unconcerned about the level at which I was drawing at the time. It was much more about, what somebody's commitment is and somebody's willingness to make mistakes and somebody's willingness to try to tell a story that needed to be told. So that was what got me into it. I had a very lucky kind of entree into the world of children's books. And I come from a family of educators. So people who love children's books and people who are elementary school teachers and social workers and people like that. So, and artists on the other side. So it felt like a very natural place for me to be. So that's, yeah.
Love it, love it. What's it like to craft for a younger audience? What do you keep in mind?
I think for me, I always, my other main kind of art form besides picture books is murals. I've been a muralist for like the last 25 years. And so it's very similar where you're kind of like, my audience is they're the people who I am around and with every day. So what I keep in mind with my books and with my murals is just that like the success of this book, it's not about me, it's really about their experience with it. And so what I really hope is that I try to leave lots of space for the kids to do a lot of figuring out. I try not to like overly explain because a lot of my books have more serious social content. I've made books about gentrification and books that center the children of incarcerated parents, like in Dad Bakes and Place Hand Here, or like books like Fish for Jimmy or Shapes, Lines, and Light, where you're talking about Japanese American history and the mass incarceration of the Japanese. And so I try to kind of share. the story and develop a character who the child will really connect with on basic human levels of being a good big brother, or being somebody who has to be brave, or being somebody who wants to connect with their friends in their community. And then as the reader, and kind of just have faith that the reader, and also maybe the librarian or the teacher or the parent, might dive a little bit deeper and say, why do you think this parent is separated from this child, or what are the big changes that are happening in their community, to kind of to step into these bigger topics when the child is ready. And so I think in my books, I give the reader and the maybe the parent reader or the adult reader a lot of credit that they'll be able to make these links. And when, like with ripples, in the at a first read, it's kind of about going down the river and kind of cleaning up the trash and working together to do that. But at a deeper level, it's about collective care and kind of how children receive care from all kinds of grown-ups, from their aunties and uncles, from their, maybe childcare providers, from their like people from older generations. So it's not just about the parent, but it's about all of these caretakers who, through the care that they provide the child learns how to not only care for like their friends and their community, but also for the planet. So it's kind of like about the agency children have to also become caretakers themselves.
Nice. Love that idea of partnering with the reader. Is there a time that you can think of that you've interacted with a young reader in kind of a surprising or interesting way? Excuse me, I'm sorry, at a school visit or during a signing or something like that?
Absolutely. Yeah. One that comes to mind is with Place Hand Here. Place Hand Here, I don't know if you're familiar with that book, but it's about a kid who's kind of connecting with his mom, or with his community during a time when his mom is away and his mom is incarcerated, which is not revealed until the very end of the book. But I think that, like, with that book, I work a lot. I work in two women's prisons doing facilitating art programs in women's prisons. And I've worked for the last like 15 years or so with communities who are impacted by incarceration. And so that book, there's so many kids who have this kind of struggle with a parent being away. But what I was hoping for on a larger scale was that every kid knows what it's like to miss somebody. So when I was doing events with that book, I would have the kids trace their hand, which came from an activity that I did with a group of incarcerated moms, where one of the moms, she traced her hand on a postcard and she wrote, "When you feel lonely, place your hand here." And she gave it to me, and she was like, "Can you give this to my sons so when they miss me, they can put their hand on top of my hand and we can feel connected." And I felt like, what an incredibly useful thing for a drawing to do. And so the so this kid in this activity, he like traced his hand, and then he drew a bunch of little pictures around. There were actually two kids in the same session, and one of them drew, he was like 7 or something, so they were very, childlike drawings. But he drew like a guy holding a baby going shh shh shh, to kind of do the shushing sound into the baby's ear. And then he drew like the dad pushing the baby on the swing, on the like baby swing. And then he said, "I miss my dad because he died when I was 4, but everybody used to tell me how he would shush me to calm me. He was really good at calming me down." And, it made me think a lot about grief, and how grief from a child's perspective and the way that they experience it. And there was another kid in that class who um, had drawn a picture of a bird. And I was like, "Oh, can you tell me about the bird?" And he said, and then he kind of started crying, and he was like, "My bird died, a couple years ago, and I miss him so much." And then I was asking him what kind of bird sounds he made. And he was saying it was a regular bird sounds, just regular chirps, and just that, like, he didn't know if it was a boy or girl bird, but he loved the bird so much. And it was very moving. I think that on many levels, like, the grief that children experience is so moving because they feel it as acutely as we feel grief, but may not have the tools to speak about it, and also may not have the space, because you think about like how, when we were doing that activity, I was thinking, how would a classroom teacher be able to kind of like fit this in with all of the requirements and all of the benchmarks that they have to make, and there's not space for that. but kids so deeply know what that feels like. And so those really stood out to me because it also kind of indicated a space where, art can be really useful, for kids to kind of have that space. And then also where they can talk about it with each other. So maybe they don't feel quite so alone with their grief. But that was very poignant. And this now with Ripples, I'm going to go on tour and we're going to kind of have a lot of like kind of really fun, I think, environmental activities on this tour, which I'm really looking forward to. Some in Minnesota, some down in Colorado, and like so it's really different, but I'm always surprised, and this goes back to like painting murals with teenage girls, in the early 2000s in Brooklyn, where they choose a topic and I'll go in thinking they're going to choose something like that I'm kind of imposing on them. And I don't say it, but I'm thinking, they're going to choose something like this because this is super current. And then they have something completely different, that's their
Yeah.
focus. And it's always amazing just like being able to be in that space where you can just listen to what they're thinking without having to guess, and just let them kind of let their art speak for itself. So yeah, I feel really lucky when it comes to doing these school visits. I was a classroom teacher for a long time, and so I was 14 years, to only 2 years full time of Spanish, and 2 years I was a full time Spanish teacher for 2 years, and then I taught art for 12 years in the public schools, like a couple days a week, same at the same school. And um, yeah, it's like so different doing school visits. On the one hand, you don't have like um, to the grind of like the of like being in the same school for all those years. But on the other hand, you don't get the depth of the relationship too. My students, I had them for 5 years in a row. So it was like I really got to know them. But that's kind of an aside.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. And love what you're saying there about art and how it can kind of give life and give words when we're not ready to kind of formalize words around
Yeah.
something yet. Uh, I was going to ask about your mural work because that is fascinating. So anything that you'd like to share about the creative process there? And it sounds like there was some collaboration, kind of giving voice to people and communities that was part of that.
Yeah. So with the murals, I think at this point I painted more than like 90 walls all around the world. So I've been doing
Wow.
it for a long time. And I think that like my main practice is very participatory. So when I'm asked to do a mural, what I like to do is really like engage with the community whose wall it is, whether that's like a community center or a prison or a school or a theater, whatever the case may be, to kind of like really work with the people who inhabit that space, because at the end of the day, that's their mural. I'm not going to see it much more other than in photos, and they inhabit that space. So the most important thing is that they feel like it represents them. So there are different approaches to murals. Some people kind of are more like street artists and they'll go and just paint whatever they are moved to paint on a certain wall and then they're gone. But for me, my process is a little bit longer. So I'll usually do like um, many workshops, drawing, writing workshops with the community who's involved, to kind of be able to create a design that's from their ideas and from their art, so that they see not just their ideas, but they see their symbols kind of in their and their concepts represented. And the goal is to take the art of many hands and make it look like it's painted by one hand. Otherwise, it gets too chaotic visually. But yeah, I think that, you know, the whole point is to shine a light on maybe a something that's been pushed way into the shadows of the margins,
Yeah.
stories that haven't been told. So sometimes, like my most recent kind of big project was at a school for kids who have special needs, a District 75 school in New York City, and they're kind of in this funny pocket of like in the heart of like the most gentrified part of Brooklyn. So on one side of the school building is the Ace Hotel, a brand new Ace Hotel, super fancy. And then there's like another fancy hotel on the other side, and across the street are these luxury lofts. And so this school, which is like pretty much 100% kids living like at or below the poverty line, 100% with really significant special needs, they're kind of like literally put into the shadows of these tall skyscrapers that have been built in these really fancy buildings. But after the pandemic, they really wanted to show, like their bravery. They chose to do like a big lion. So they chose to they wanted a lion. So we made the lion huge. The lion is like the entire side of the building, but then also with like the teachers wanted to show how protective they are. The kids wanted to show how brave they are. So the lion really worked on a few levels, but um, then kind of also the adjustments that everybody had to make during the pandemic because we painted this one in 2022 and the teachers, kind of really spoke about how adaptable they had to be to maintain like a safe environment and maintain a steady environment for the kids, especially because these kids came from the neighborhoods that were most heavily hit by COVID. And so, the lion is kind of set inside of what looks like a ball pit, like a Chuck E. Cheese ball pit, like with the circles. And then it's full of kids who are doing all the kinds of things that kids like to do, play basketball and reading and running and football and stargazing and singing and dancing and all of those things so that they could look recognizable to other kids in their community because I think they felt like a lot of the time people would see them and see them just as different, maybe getting helped off the bus in a very intensive specific way or whatever because of their special needs or on the playground, with really significant special needs, and they wanted to kind of show the variety of who they are and the depth of who they are. So that's like an example. But I think, yeah, the main thing for me is kind of like how there are so many stories to be told, and so often the same stories just get told over and over, but there are so many people whose stories, and like I always reject when people are like giving voice to the voiceless, because it's not that anybody is voiceless, it's that not
Right.
everybody has a platform. So I think it's like using the mural as a platform or using the book as a platform to tell the story of people whose stories just don't get told in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, today, as I mentioned, is a book birthday for you. Anything that you'd like to say about Ripples and what you're exploring next in your work?
Sure. So for Ripples, I really what I really hope is that when kids read this and when grown-ups read it to kids, because it's definitely a book for younger readers, is that they see that the things that we need to be able to care for one another and care for the earth are mostly things that we already know how to do. They're things that we need to tend to the earth, we need to listen to the earth, we need to clean and feed and give space to the earth, and to each other. And those are all things that are kind of like basic tenets of care. And I think that like when we can take time, it's a kind of a quiet book. It's about a float down a river, and it's about a kid with her aunt kind of just like kind of noticing the things around them, noticing the way that like the way that it feels to be out on a beautiful day, and noticing where care needs to be taken, and also where care is being given all around. And I think that like the first step is kind of having enough quiet and having enough space where we can do some noticing. What is it that we need to do and what is it that we already know how to do? So, and then how can we kind of enact that? So I think with kids, an immediate way is also just thinking about like how we can care for one another. If you see somebody who's in trouble, what can we do? Or if you see somebody who needs some kind of attention, what can we do? And then also just like observing the world and paying attention. It's a lot about paying attention and then what we do in response. And so, um, I think I always remember my godson when he was really little, like we were at Union Square. He was like 1.5, and we were just like sitting on the ground in Union Square, and his mom had taken out a wipe, and he just started to wipe the ground, at Union Square, which is of course a lost cause, but like the idea that like he already kind of knew at 1.5, like, oh, we care for the world around us. That just like what my mom does, like I'm going to do that too. And it's also about like um just kind of looking to all of the grown-ups in a kid's life who are providing care as models for this care. I think that often books are about like the mom or the dad, and that's great. And also there are all these like other grown-ups who are taking such incredible care of all of our children and really like giving them the credit. So this book is not specific about who the caretakers are, and they're from different generations and different kind of backgrounds. And I think that that's also an important point of who identifies and who's identified as like primary caretakers in our children's life. So, and looking forward, most immediately I have this book tour coming up, and the way that they set it up, I love because every event is partnered with like a community based organization that does something of care. So a lot of it is environmental, and then there are some that are like more food related and things like that. But they're kind of just how we can put all of these worlds together, the book world with an environmental group, with a food pantry group, just that like there are so many ways to be involved, and you don't have to do something big. If everybody does something small, it makes a huge difference. Yeah. And then
Absolutely.
I just on Wednesday, the book's birthday is today, and last Wednesday I turned in my next book, which is called Invisible Crown, which I'm super excited about. So that
Cool.
yeah, that's kind of what's going on. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like your creating is continuing and continuing actively. So eager to see what's next. Anywhere that people can go online in person to find out more and follow along.
Sure. Well, my Instagram is just my name at Katie Yamasaki, and I'm trying to be regularly posting there, trying my best. And then I have a website which is also my name, and yeah, I'm looking forward to also, recently part of this conversation, this about care came up just because, in the years that I've been working in the prison, watching a lot of the women in my classes who have not received like the care that they deserve as human beings, watching them cultivate these communities of care within the prison, kind of against all odds, has been like very moving for me. And just kind of inspiring where you see like if you can cultivate care in this environment you can really do it anywhere, and so soon we'll be able to share a little bit more about their work as well, just on a website that we're kind of cultivating with their art from a recent exhibit that we had with like the last few years of their kind of art making inside. So that will be up as well, so keep an eye out for that. Yeah.
Well, Katie, delighted to talk with you. Glad to have you in this space, and certainly glad to have you back anytime to talk about the creating and the advocacy that you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you for such thoughtful questions. I really appreciate it.